The Dawn's Return. Written by Short Story Queen. Chapter 1. The Man in the Diner. Rain slicked the pavement in thin, trembling lines outside the fogged diner windows. It was past midnight, the hour when only ghosts and broken people were still awake. Amara wiped down the counter with a rag that smelled faintly of bleach and coffee, her movements mechanical, her mind elsewhere. Sleep would not come later. It rarely did these days. Dreams had never been kind to her, especially not the ones where his face returned. The bell above the door hadn't rung. She was certain of it. Yet when she looked up, there was a man in the far booth, seated like he'd always been there, alone, half in shadow, the kind of figure that would have made her uneasy once, back when her nerves still warned her about men like him. Now her nerves were numb. She grabbed the pot of lukewarm coffee and started toward the booth, not thinking much of it. Late-night wanderers weren't rare in this part of town. Drifters, drunks, lonely souls. The kind who didn't expect smiles. She didn't offer one anyway. But with every step, something in her gut twisted. It wasn't fear. It was recognition, curling through her spine like a cold hand pressing on old scars. She stopped beside the booth. "Refill?" The man didn't look up at first. His jaw was set, his hands clasped on the table as if holding still was the only thing keeping him from unraveling. The edge of his face caught the glow from the hanging bulb overhead, the harsh line of his cheekbone, the familiar stubble on his chin, the scar she didn't remember. But it was the eyes that unraveled her. Not because they were warm, because they weren't. Dark, unreadable, and far too alive. Her voice didn't come. Her throat dried up, breath caught somewhere between denial and madness. She stared, frozen, the pot tilting slightly in her hand until it spilled a few drops on the table between them. He didn't flinch. He looked at her like he was seeing a ghost, or maybe like he'd become one. "Sit," he said finally, and the sound of his voice shattered the illusion that she was mistaken, that this was a dream, or a man who only looked like Dante. Her Dante had died 3 years ago in an explosion that left nothing but a scorched car and an empty coffin. She'd seen the fire. She'd buried a name. She'd run, carrying more than just grief in her belly. Yet here he was, alive. And wrong. Something in him had twisted during those missing years. He wore it like armor. In the stiffness of his posture, in the ice layered over his tone. Whatever had kept him alive hadn't been mercy. Amara's legs didn't want to move, but she sat, because her knees couldn't hold her anymore. "You're supposed to be dead." Her voice barely broke the air between them. "And you were supposed to disappear." His gaze dropped briefly to the coffee stain. "Clearly, we both failed." Her fingers curled into the edge of the table, knuckles bloodless. She wanted to ask 1,000 questions, scream, cry. But her instincts, sharper than ever after years in hiding, told her to listen, to wait. "They're coming for you," Dante said, as if they'd been speaking all along. "For you and the boy." She said nothing. Her heart was doing a strange, quiet stutter in her chest. Not panic, not relief. Just a slow, spiraling descent into disbelief. He leaned forward. "They found out you're alive. They didn't expect it. Now they need to clean it up." "How do you know that?" Her words were cautious, measured. "Because I was supposed to clean it up." The silence between them stretched tight, and in it something fragile cracked. Amara stood reaching for her purse. She moved slowly, carefully. Not because she was afraid of him, but because he wasn't who she remembered. Her Dante had touched her like she was glass. This one hadn't even flinched when her hand had shaken. He felt like stone. "I don't know what you want from me," she whispered. "But if this is some kind of warning, you've given it. I'll handle the rest. You won't make it out of this town by morning. I've done harder." He stood too then, and the diner felt too small. He was taller than she remembered. Or maybe just more solid. Like grief and revenge had carved a second body over the one she once loved. "You have a child," he said low. "A boy." Amara's pulse missed a beat. "I saw him," he added, "through the window. He looks like me." "You're mistaken." "No, I'm not." A pause. "He called you Mama, and asked if you could make his waffles not burn next time." Her jaw clenched, but she didn't speak. "You should have told me," he said, no judgment, no heat. Just that hollow tone again. "He deserves to know who he is." "He deserves to be safe," she snapped. "And he won't be unless you come with me now." Her breath caught again, but not from emotion, from the certainty in his voice, the same voice that used to promise forever. Now it offered only survival. She didn't say yes, but she didn't say no either. When she returned home 20 minutes later, Leo was curled up in a ball on the couch, one foot hanging off the side, wearing a mismatched pair of socks and hugging a stuffed alligator. She stared at him for a long time before waking him gently. "Sweetheart," she said, her voice thick. "We're going on a little trip, okay?" Leo blinked up at her. "Is Batman coming?" She hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, he is." By the time they reached the black car waiting in the alley behind the diner, Dante had already opened the backseat door. He said nothing as Leo climbed in, chattering about waffles and villains and whether Batman got to stay up past bedtime. Amara sat in the passenger seat, silent. Dante pulled away from the curb without a word. She didn't look at him, but she didn't look away either. Chapter 2. The Ghost and the Sun. The car moved through the sleeping town like a whisper, taillights glowing red in the rain-washed dark. Amara sat rigid in the passenger seat, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, watching the reflection of the road glide across the windshield in smears of silver and gray. The silence between them was thick, held together by everything unsaid. Dante's focus stayed forward, his hands steady on the wheel, his jaw tense with something she couldn't read. Once she'd known what every shift in his expression meant. Now she wasn't even sure if this man could feel anything at all. Behind them, Leo kicked his small legs against the seat, humming off-key and softly narrating whatever adventure played in his mind. Occasionally, he made siren sounds, then growled like a tiger. The innocence of it lanced through the silence, absurd and pure, like a candle burning in the middle of a battlefield. Dante didn't react to the noise, not outwardly. But once, when Leo asked why all the trees looked sleepy, Amara saw Dante's fingers tighten around the steering wheel, not in irritation, but in restraint, as if he didn't trust himself to answer. The road eventually slipped into forested outskirts where lights were scarce and the night felt heavier. Amara glanced at Dante, the profile of him unfamiliar and painfully familiar all at once. The lines of his face had sharpened not just with age but with something weightier. Life had dug in with a chisel. He didn't move like a man who'd been rescued. He moved like a man who'd pulled himself from the grave one cracked bone at a time. She didn't ask where they were going. She suspected he wouldn't tell her. Or worse, that he would. They turned off the main road and followed a winding dirt track flanked by tall pines. After a mile, Dante eased the car behind what looked like a storage shed, half buried by ivy and shadows. No lights. No other vehicles. Just quiet. He killed the engine. Amara's hand brushed the door handle, not to escape. She'd already made the choice to follow him, whatever that meant. But out of instinct, a readiness that hadn't left her since Leo was born. "We'll stay here for a few hours," Dante said, his voice low even. "Long enough to confirm they didn't follow." "You're sure they're coming?" "I'm sure they're looking, and I'm sure you being alive changes things." She almost asked what that meant, but Leo's voice broke the moment. "Is this Batman's cave?" he asked, peering out the window. Amara unbuckled him slowly and helped him out. His stuffed alligator was clutched tight in one hand, his eyes wide and curious. He looked up at Dante, frowning a little. "You look tired." Dante blinked at him. "Do I?" Leo nodded solemnly. "You should nap. Mama says naps make people less grumpy." Amara braced for the usual cold deflection for that blank stare Dante had worn like armor since the diner. But something shifted. A flicker of something behind his eyes. Amusement, maybe, or confusion. He crouched just enough to meet Leo's gaze. "I'll think about it," he said. They moved into the shed, which was larger than it looked from the outside. Inside, it was dry, with crates stacked against the walls and a fold-out cot in the corner. Supplies had been left. Canned food, water, a few blankets. Amara watched him closely. None of this was thrown together. This was planned. He had been watching her longer than he'd admitted. She didn't ask how long. She didn't want the answer. She laid out a blanket for Leo, who made a bed beside the crates and immediately began building a pillow fort. The absurdity of it pressed against the ache in her chest. This mix of danger and domesticity. Her son had no idea he was now wrapped in a war that started before he was born. Dante busied himself checking the windows and reinforcing the door. Amara stood still, arms crossed, her gaze tracking him. "So this is your plan?" she asked finally, voice low. "To drag us from one dark hole to another until the people chasing you catch up?" "I don't drag people, you came." "Because you said we were in danger." "You are." She stepped closer, not aggressive but unflinching. "And what happens after this? We hide forever? We wait for another bomb? Another bullet?" Dante turned then slowly, and the weight of his stare hit her with full force, but there was something underneath it now. Not anger, not calculation. Weariness, maybe. Or something older. Regret. But it passed too quickly to be sure. "I have a plan," he said after a long pause. But I didn't expect him. His gaze slid past her toward Leo, who was now wrapping a towel around his shoulders and pretending to fly. Amara's heart twisted. "I didn't expect you either," he added quietly. "I mourned you," she said, and there was no edge in it, just fact. "I burned the life we were supposed to have. Then I built another one from the ashes." "I know." "No, you don't." He looked at her, truly looked, and for a second she glimpsed the man she had once loved. The one who whispered secrets into her hair, who carved promises into the hollow of her back. That man had died. But this one, this cold survivor, still remembered. And maybe that was worse. Leo ran up suddenly, holding out a crumpled drawing, a scribble of blue and black lines with stick figures in the middle. "This is you," he said, pointing to a lopsided shape with spiky hair. "And this is Mama. And that's me with my alligator. We're a team." Amara didn't move. She watched Dante's hand lower slowly to take the paper. He held it like it might break apart if he breathed too hard. He didn't speak, but he nodded once. "Cool," Leo added, then darted back to his nest. Dante stood frozen a moment longer, then folded the picture and slid it into his coat pocket. Amara felt the ache bloom deep in her chest. The cruel ache of wanting someone back, only to find them changed beyond recognition. And yet, still his hand had trembled. Still his voice softened when he spoke to their son. She didn't trust him. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But her heart, traitorous thing, remembered. Outside, the rain had stopped. The wind had died. Inside that quiet space, 3 people shared a silence that wasn't quite peace but wasn't war either. And for now, that was enough. Chapter 3. Motel Walls and Unspoken Truths. The sun rose in a haze of gray and gold, muted through the stained curtains of the roadside motel. One of those places that smelled faintly of mildew and old smoke, where the buzzing light in the bathroom never fully turned off, and the mattress sank like it was trying to swallow you whole. Amara had stayed in worse, she'd stayed in better too, but comfort had never been the point. Distance was. Distance from the city, from the last name she'd spent years hiding, from everything Dante had once been and everything she had become in his absence. She stood at the edge of the room now, arms wrapped around herself, watching Leo sleep tangled in the sheets of the motel bed. He'd talked himself into exhaustion the night before, narrating their adventure with the kind of bravery only toddlers could summon. Something about secret caves, fire escapes, and invisible jetpacks. He'd fallen asleep mid-sentence, his hand still clutching the tail of his stuffed alligator. Dante was by the window, his silhouette cut in half by the early light. He hadn't spoken much since they'd arrived. Instead, he paced slowly, or stood still, always watching the parking lot, the doorway, the stretch of road beyond the cracked glass. Amara had seen men haunted before. She'd seen them twitch at every sound, seen the way suspicion hollowed them from the inside out. But with Dante, it wasn't twitchy panic or erratic fear. It was quiet calculation, like he was mapping every inch of the world around him in case he had to break it apart. She didn't speak until she had to. How long? Her voice was soft, barely louder than the hum of the vent above them. How long have you known we were alive? He didn't turn immediately. When he did, his face gave nothing away. Almost a year. It hit harder than she expected, even knowing the answer wouldn't be kind. A year. 12 months of silence. 12 months of watching them from whatever dark corner he'd buried himself in. 12 months where she'd believed she was finally safe. You watched us, she said, not accusing, just trying to understand the shape of the truth. I had to be sure. Of what? That no one else knew before I did. That you weren't part of it. She laughed once, sharp and soft at the same time. A sound without humor. Part of what? Blowing you into a fireball? He didn't answer. She stepped toward him slowly, keeping her voice low to avoid waking Leo. You think I knew? That I somehow helped them destroy you? I didn't know what to think, he said after a long pause. I was underground, bleeding, hunted. When I came back, everything I knew was ash. My brother was sitting at my table. Your name was gone. The people I trusted scattered like roaches. And so you assumed I'd crawled away with them? No, he said and finally looked at her. I assumed you were dead, until I saw your face in a gas station security feed 8 months ago. That image, her buying juice and diapers in the middle of the night, hood up, hair tied back, eyes tired, flickered in her mind now, sudden and sharp. She hadn't known then that someone had been watching, that he had been watching. And you didn't come then? She asked. You waited, watched, like we were just a threat to be assessed. You had a child, he said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't name, some hollow note that wasn't quite grief or anger. I didn't know if he was mine. And now you do. He didn't answer, not with words. Just let the silence stretch, heavy and complicated. The weight of 3 years sat between them, more powerful than rage. Because they weren't strangers, not really. Strangers didn't hurt like this. Strangers didn't know the shape of your breathing at midnight, or how you took your coffee, or which song made you cry without reason. I named him Leo, she said, as if the name might offer something back, for the strength I hoped he'd need. Dante turned away then, not harshly, just quietly, as if he couldn't look at her anymore. She watched the line of his shoulders, the subtle shift of tension that hadn't left since the moment he walked into that diner. She wondered how many nights he'd sat in shadows, how many times he'd tried to convince himself to stay away. I thought I'd buried you, she said, her voice softening. I grieved you like a widow, and I became a mother the same week I lost you. Do you have any idea what it's like to love a child that fiercely, and still feel like part of you died giving birth to him? Dante's breath caught just once. Amara stepped closer, not to hurt, not to accuse, but because she needed him to understand. I didn't keep him from you out of revenge. I kept him from the world you left behind. From bullets and betrayal and men who think loyalty is a weapon. He turned slowly, eyes locking with hers in the dim room. There was no coldness in his gaze now, no distance. Only a rawness that scraped at the edges of who he'd become. I wasn't ready to be a father, he said, his voice rough, but I never stopped being yours. The words landed in her like a stone in still water, sending ripples through the places she'd boarded up. He meant it, not as an excuse, but as a truth carved out of what was left of the man she'd once loved. She didn't answer. Couldn't. Instead, she turned toward the bed where Leo had begun to stir, his arms stretching up with the exaggerated drama only small children could manage. He blinked at them both, then rubbed his eyes and sat up, his curls wild from sleep. Are we still on the secret mission? He asked through a yawn. Amara nodded gently. We are. Leo considered this, then looked at Dante. Are you coming too, Batman? Dante didn't flinch at the nickname this time. He crouched beside the bed, slow and deliberate, and reached out a hand, not quite touching, just waiting. If you want me to, he said. Leo looked at his mother, then at the man beside him, and after a beat, placed his small hand in Dante's. I want waffles, he said seriously, with no burns. Dante managed a smile that barely curved his mouth. I'll work on it. And just like that, something shifted in the space between them. Not forgiveness, not resolution, but a beginning. Or perhaps a second beginning, this time built not on promises, but on what had survived the fire. They would leave soon, move again before the trail caught up. But for a few quiet moments in a motel room that smelled of mildew and dawn, they weren't ghosts or fugitives or broken things held together by duty. They were simply three people bound by blood, history, and the kind of love that refuses to die, no matter how long it's been buried. Chapter 4. Bloodlines and Burdens. They drove until the roads narrowed and the landscape shifted from cracked pavement to open stretches of pine and dusk-colored soil. The world outside became less recognizable with every passing mile, as if they were being peeled away from the life they knew, stripped down to something rawer, colder, more exposed. Amara didn't ask where they were headed. Dante didn't offer. It had become a rhythm between them. She watched, he led, and somewhere in the silence between their breaths, something old stirred again. Leo slept in the back seat, his head tilted awkwardly against a pillow he'd insisted on bringing from the motel. The worn fabric cradled beneath his cheek. His shoes had fallen off hours ago, and one sock dangled halfway down his foot. Amara twisted slightly to check on him, brushing a curl from his forehead, her hand lingering longer than necessary. The rise and fall of his chest was slow, steady, unaware. When she turned back around, Dante's eyes flicked briefly toward her. Not long enough to break his focus on the road, but enough for her to feel it. There was a question there, or maybe a memory. The space between them was thick with both. They reached the safe house just after nightfall. It wasn't much, a cabin tucked into the forest, set behind a rusted gate that groaned when it opened. The structure leaned slightly to one side as if time had pressed its weight against the foundation and dared it to stand. Inside, it smelled of dust and cedar, and the furniture had the look of things that once belonged to people who never planned to return. The lights flickered weakly when Dante flipped the switch, casting shadows across the wood-paneled walls. Amara settled Leo in one of the small back rooms, coaxing him into bed with the promise of stories in the morning. He barely stirred. The day had taken its toll on him, though he would never admit it. Always the adventurer, always pretending nothing could frighten him. She kissed his cheek, pulled the blanket higher, and stood in the doorway a moment, just watching. There were days she still didn't understand how someone so fragile and loud and bright had come from her body during the darkest part of her life. When she stepped into the main room, Dante was already laying out supplies. 2 handguns, a knife, cash folded neatly into a black pouch, and a worn folder with frayed corners. He worked methodically, silently, the same way he had when they were younger, and planning something they shouldn't have been, an escape, a negotiation, a night away from responsibility. She recognized the way his hands moved, the practiced efficiency, the stillness of a man who'd trained himself to disappear. "I assume this is another one of your places," she said finally, stepping closer. "Not mine anymore," he answered without looking up. "Belong to someone who doesn't ask questions." "Do they know we're here?" "They won't know I was." She didn't press further, not because she trusted him completely. She didn't. But because she knew the kind of people who owed Dante Russo favors. They were the sort who knew better than to look him in the eye, let alone speak his name once he walked out their door. He sat on the edge of the old couch and pulled his shirt over his head without ceremony. The scar on his side caught the dim light, a long, raised line that ran from his ribs to his lower back, angry and pale against his skin. Amara stared before she could stop herself. That wound hadn't been there before. She didn't ask how it happened. She didn't need to. "You should let me clean that," she said, gesturing to the bandage still wrapped around his upper arm, faintly stained with blood. Dante hesitated, then nodded once. She retrieved the first aid kit from the counter, knelt beside him, and carefully began to unwind the cloth. The wound beneath was shallow, but ugly. A graze, likely from a bullet that came too close. He didn't flinch as she worked, but she felt the way his muscles tightened beneath her touch, how his breathing slowed just enough to stay steady. "You've changed," she murmured, not as an accusation, but as an observation. "You haven't." She didn't know what that meant, if it was meant to hurt or to heal, but his voice had softened just enough to sting. She dipped a cloth into the antiseptic and pressed it to the wound. "This life," she said, her voice quieter now. "You always swore you'd leave it behind. For me. For something better." "I did." "No," she said, shaking her head. "You tried. That's not the same." He didn't argue. Just let the silence settle around them again, heavy and warm. "I never stopped looking for a way out," he said eventually, "but I stopped believing one existed." She glanced up then, her hand still pressed lightly against his arm. "So why come back? Why now?" He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then his gaze drifted past her, to the room where Leo slept. "Because you weren't the only one who built something from the ashes," he said. "And I realized I still had something worth protecting." Her throat tightened, the cloth slipped from her fingers. She didn't trust herself to speak. Instead, she stood, moving to put away the kit, needing something to do with her hands. But before she could step away, Dante reached out, fingers wrapping gently around her wrist. "Amara?" She turned to him, her breath caught in her chest. His hand didn't move higher, didn't pull, just held. "I don't know what comes next," he said, his voice low. "But I don't want to disappear again. Not from you. Not from him." Something broke inside her at that, not in pain, but in release. She had buried him once, had buried everything they could have been, and yet here he was, not asking for forgiveness, but for a place beside them, not promising peace, but presence. She didn't answer. Instead, she stepped closer, slowly, carefully, and let her forehead rest against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet. It wasn't a kiss, not yet, but it was the beginning of something she thought she'd never feel again. And for that moment in a cabin forgotten by the world, with danger still hunting them and a past they couldn't outrun, Amara allowed herself to believe that some ghosts didn't come back to haunt. Some came back to stay. Chapter 5. The Kiss That Shouldn't Happen. The next morning came with no warning, just a gray wash of light slipping in through the cabin's narrow windows. The forest outside was hushed, its silence stretching long and far, as if even the trees knew how to stay quiet when danger hovered too close. Inside, the floor creaked with every step, the old wood giving away secrets Amara wished it would keep. Leo had woken early, full of questions and wild energy, but now, at last, he was down for a nap on the cot in the smaller back room. It had taken 3 books, 2 stories about dragons, and a heated debate over whether raccoons could talk to turtles, but eventually he had surrendered. His soft breathing drifted faintly through the cracked door. Amara leaned against the frame for a moment, just watching him sleep, letting the quiet settle over her like a second skin. She found Dante outside, crouched near the shed behind the cabin, working with practiced focus. He was cleaning one of the guns, the morning light catching along the edges of the metal. His shirt was off again, the scar across his ribs visible as he moved. He looked like someone carved out of stone and shadows, the kind of man who didn't just survive the impossible. He carried it with him like armor. Amara stepped out, the chill brushing her skin. He didn't glance up, but his voice found her. He sleeps like you do, legs twisted in every direction. She paused. I didn't know you remembered that. I remember everything. There was no accusation in it, no longing either, just truth, laid down in the space between them. She walked toward him, arms crossed loosely, eyes catching on the scar again. What happened to you? She asked softly. After the car, after the explosion. Dante didn't answer immediately. He finished checking the slide on the gun, reassembled it with quick fingers, then sat back on his heels and looked up at her. They pulled me from the wreck, he said, his tone low and even. Not to save me, just to make sure I wasn't found. Who? My brother. And whoever he's pretending not to work for. His eyes darkened. They didn't expect me to crawl out of the hole they left me in. Amara crouched beside him, not to match his stance but to close the space between them. The cold ground pressed through her jeans, but she didn't move. Her gaze held his. You should have come to me, she whispered. I would have run with you. I would have stayed. I couldn't risk it, not until I knew who I could trust, not until I knew you weren't already dead because of me. The air between them shifted. A breeze stirred the trees, brushing the leaves like breath across skin. Amara looked down at her hands, fingers curled loosely in her lap. You looked different in the diner, she said after a pause, not just your face, everything about you. I am different. I know. But even as she said it, even as she acknowledged that whatever version of Dante she had loved had died in that fire, part of her still recognized the weight of him. Not just the physical presence, but the way he filled silence. The way his gaze could still pull her apart without touching her. He stood first, brushing the dirt from his hands, then turned and stepped back toward the cabin. She followed, the path between them narrowing with every stride. Inside, the cabin was dim and warm from the wood stove Dante had fed earlier. He moved to the map spread out across the table, studying it, but she watched him instead. I hate that you left me to grieve you, she said quietly, the words barely louder than a breath. I hate that you thought I was safer alone. I wasn't. He turned slowly, and in the low light, the hollows beneath his eyes looked deeper. I'm sorry. The words didn't erase anything, but they held weight. More than she'd expected from him. They reached a part of her that had been holding itself shut for too long. I should be furious with you, she said. You are. Yes. But she didn't step away, saying neither did he. For a moment, neither of them moved, the air between them thick with everything that hadn't been said, everything they'd been burying under caution and need. Then, slowly, without ceremony, she reached for him. Her fingers brushed his chest first, just above the old scar that led down his ribs. His breath caught, not dramatically, just enough for her to feel it. She looked up. His eyes were steady, but his body had stilled as if he was waiting for something. Her permission, her anger, her pull. Something between instinct and memory took over then, and she leaned in, slowly, cautiously, until her mouth met his. The kiss wasn't soft, it wasn't gentle. It was hungry and desperate and unsteady, like it had been waiting too long and no longer cared how it arrived. His hands found her hips, anchored her in place. Her fingers curled into the curve of his shoulder. There was no hesitation, but there was heat. Familiar, aching heat that made her heart stammer and her knees forget how to hold her weight. But then she stopped. She pulled back just enough to breathe, just enough to let the moment slip through her fingers before it turned into something she couldn't take back. Her forehead rested against his. Their breaths mingled again, shallow and warm. "This doesn't fix anything," she whispered, "and I know. We're still running. I know. I don't trust you." His hand found hers, his thumb grazing the edge of her knuckle, the touch maddeningly soft for someone with blood on his hands. "I don't trust myself," he said. That was what finally made her step back. Not out of anger, not out of fear, but because it was too real, too raw. She walked away slowly, her hands shaking just enough to betray her. She didn't look back as she disappeared down the hallway to check on Leo. Behind her, she felt his gaze linger, not possessive, not pleading, just there, watching, waiting, learning how to love her again, one unspoken truth at a time. Chapter 6. Zia's House of Chaos. By the time the car rounded the bend in the road and the crooked iron gates of Zia Livia's estate came into view, Amara could already hear the creak of the wind chimes and the screech of the front screen door in her memory. The house hadn't changed. It still looked like something caught halfway between grandeur and collapse, all cracked shutters and ivy-choked bricks, with a sagging roof that had once been red, but now seemed permanently dusted with leaves and time. A statue of St. Anthony leaned sideways in the garden like he'd given up trying to save the place long ago. Leo had fallen asleep again in the back seat, his face smushed against a juice-stained travel pillow, his tiny arm draped over the stuffed alligator who'd been granted the honor of front seat status. Amara turned slightly to look at him, her heart catching for a moment in that way it always did when he was quiet, a soft reminder that even in the middle of chaos, something still belonged to her completely. Dante parked the car under the overgrown canopy of trees, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. He didn't speak. His gaze moved over the house as if taking inventory of its weaknesses. But Amara knew better than to interpret his silence as discomfort. This place wasn't dangerous, not for them. Zia Livia might be chaos incarnate, but she was loyal in a way that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with stubborn, unfiltered love. They didn't even reach the porch before the door flew open and Livia herself came barreling down the steps. A whirlwind of frizzed gray curls, floral prints, and heavy gold bracelets that clinked with every motion. Her mouth was already moving before she made it halfway down. "Dio mio, look at you, skinny as a broom handle. Your eyes all hollow. You dress like a fugitive." "Don't tell me you are a fugitive. And where's my nephew? The one who got himself blown up and didn't have the decency to stay that way?" Amara barely had time to open her arms before Livia crushed her in a hug that knocked the air from her lungs. The smell of lavender soap and burnt coffee clung to her like an old quilt. It didn't matter how long she'd been gone. Livia always folded her back in without question, without judgment. "I missed you too, Zia," Amara whispered into her shoulder. Livia pulled back just enough to hold her face, squinting at her like she could see through the skin and straight into her heart. "You look tired." "I am." "Good. That means you're still alive." Her gaze slid past Amara, then landing on Dante, who had stepped out of the car and now stood with one hand on the roof, his expression unreadable. Livia's smile flattened into a thin line. She crossed her arms. "So the ghost rises," she said. Dante met her stare, unfazed. "Good to see you too, Livia." "Mm-hmm." She tilted her head. "If I had a slipper handy, I'd throw it at you." "Wouldn't be the first time." She snorted, turned, and waved them all toward the house. "Come on, I'll feed you before I yell at you." Inside, the house was every bit as chaotic as Amara remembered. The smell of rosemary and garlic clung to the wallpaper. Every surface held something: lace runners, dusty picture frames, porcelain saints, and cracked ashtrays full of half-used incense sticks. A cat no one claimed ownership of darted between rooms, pausing only to hiss at Dante before disappearing under the couch. Leo woke slowly as Amara carried him in, blinking in confusion before he realized where they were. He perked up instantly when Livia handed him a biscotti the size of his hand and told him he could eat on the couch only this one time. He settled in like a prince claiming his throne, legs dangling, crumbs falling everywhere. Amara stood in the kitchen doorway and watched as Dante moved through the space like a ghost retracing old steps. His fingers brushed the countertop, the edge of the sink, the place where Livia used to keep a chipped jar full of almonds he never ate. He was quiet, but something in his shoulders had changed. He looked less like a man under siege, more like someone standing in a memory he hadn't expected to still exist. Later, after Leo had been coaxed into bed with stories of singing donkeys and magical trees, Amara found Dante on the back porch, a glass of something amber in his hand. The night air was soft, full of the scent of rain and soil. Crickets sang, somewhere in the dark. She joined him without a word, leaning against the railing beside him, her gaze focused on the garden where the old lemon tree still leaned sideways under its own weight. "She hasn't changed," Amara said quietly. "No, but you have." She didn't answer. The silence didn't need to be filled. It was a rare kind of stillness, one that came not from safety, but from proximity, from the way their bodies, even after all this time, still seemed to know how to take up space near each other. "You were never supposed to see this side of me," Dante said after a long moment. "The part that came after the fire. The man who crawled out of it wasn't built to be loved." Amara's fingers curled around the edge of the railing. "You think I'm in love with the man you were?" she asked, voice low. "I was. But I never got to see who you became. You didn't let me. I didn't know if I'd survive long enough to try." His voice was steady, but there was something raw beneath it, something tender and reluctant. It wasn't an apology, not really, just an opening. Amara looked at him then. Really looked. Not at the face she had once kissed or the hands she used to hold, but at the man standing beside her now. Scarred, exhausted, still standing. She saw the weight he carried, the years he'd lost, the guilt that clung to him like another layer of skin. And beneath all of it, she saw something she hadn't dared to believe still existed. Hope? Not the naive kind, not the bright-eyed dream of a clean slate, but the quiet kind. The kind you felt when you realized someone hadn't given up on trying, even after everything. She reached for his hand, and this time he let her take it. No walls, no distance, just the warmth of skin against skin, the way two people who had every reason to run finally let themselves stand still. He didn't kiss her, and she didn't ask him to. But when she leaned her head gently against his shoulder and felt the way he leaned back just enough to meet her there, she knew. Something had shifted, and this time it wasn't going anywhere. Chapter 7. Rico's Offer. The call came just after midnight, long after the house had gone still. Livia had retired to her cluttered bedroom with a cigarette tucked behind her ear and a muttered warning about ghosts overstaying their welcome. Leo, after demanding 2 lullabies and a glass of water that he refused to drink, had finally collapsed in a heap of limbs and tangled blankets. Amara had been sitting at the foot of his bed, watching the rise and fall of his chest when the low buzz of Dante's burner phone cut through the quiet. He was already halfway down the hallway by the time she followed him. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. There was something about the way he moved, too calm, too deliberate, that told her everything she needed to know. Whatever had been said on the other end of that call, it hadn't come from a stranger. It had come from someone who knew how to cut directly into him. The night air was colder than before. A mist hung low over the yard, wrapping the lemon tree in silver threads. Dante stood with his hands braced on the porch railing, his phone dark in his palm. He didn't turn when she approached. "Rico," he said quietly. "He wants to meet." The name cracked the stillness like glass underfoot. Amara felt her chest tighten, not from fear, but from something sharper. Memory, betrayal. The way that name had once been spoken with familiarity and trust. Dante's younger brother, clever and magnetic, always skimming just beneath the edge of danger. until he'd pushed too far and sold out his own blood to take the throne. He says he wants to talk, Dante continued. Alone. No weapons. No tricks. Amara didn't speak. She simply moved to stand beside him, close enough to feel the tension bleeding off his body in waves. Do you believe him? She asked. No. Then why go? His gaze stayed on the trees, unmoving. Because if I don't, he'll come here. And he won't be alone. She knew he was right. Rico had always played two games at once, charming on the surface, calculating beneath. He was the type who smiled as he pulled the trigger, and worse, the type who made you believe he was doing it for your own good. Where? She asked. Dante looked down at the phone again. The old distillery on Harper's Ridge. Midnight tomorrow. Amara reached for his hand without thinking. He let her take it, fingers curling around hers slowly, as if the gesture still surprised him. His grip was strong, but not forceful. She held onto it like she was trying to memorize the shape of him, in case tomorrow didn't return him whole. You're not going there to make peace, she said, and it wasn't a question. No. She nodded once. Her heart thudded dully behind her ribs, heavy and steady. She wanted to tell him not to go. Wanted to ask him to stay, to choose safety over vengeance. But she knew it wouldn't change anything. This was a path that had been written long before he returned to her. The only choice now was whether he walked it alone. The distillery loomed in the distance like a ghost of the past, its skeletal frame silhouetted against the darkening sky. Long abandoned, forgotten by everyone, except the ones who had once filled its halls with smoke and plans and violence. It was a place thick with memory, with old deals and broken promises, and tonight, it would be a place of reckoning. Dante arrived first. He parked the car on the far edge of the property and walked in alone, as instructed. His steps echoed in the cavernous space, the floorboards groaning beneath his weight. The air smelled of mold and dust and something metallic. He didn't bring a weapon, not out of trust, but because he knew Rico would be expecting him to. Better to arrive exactly as invited, and let the danger come to him in full view. Rico was waiting near the back wall, his figure half lit by the flickering light of a single hanging bulb. He looked just as Dante remembered. Tailored, smug, a gold chain glinting at his throat and a grin that never quite reached his eyes. A predator dressed like a prince. I almost didn't believe it, Rico said, stepping forward. You really are hard to kill. Dante didn't flinch. You should have aimed higher. Rico laughed, the sound echoing in the vast space. Still sharp. I missed that. I didn't. Rico spread his arms. No guards, no ambush. Just me, offering you a deal. There's nothing you could offer that I'd want. I can offer peace for her, for the boy. The words were deliberate, calculated. Dante's jaw tightened. You don't speak their names. I'm not here to threaten you, Rico said, voice smooth. I'm here to give you a way out. Walk away. Leave the city. Disappear for good this time. I'll make sure they're protected. I'll make sure they're left alone. In exchange for what? Your silence. Your surrender. Let me keep what I built. Let the past stay buried. Dante stepped closer, slowly, until the space between them was too thin for lies. You tried to kill me. You were in the way. You buried me. And yet here you are? Rico smiled. We could call it even. We both got what we wanted. You have a second chance. I have the family. Let's not ruin it. Dante stared at him for a long moment, then he smiled, cold and slow. Every empire you build on betrayal collapses, and every vendetta ends in blood. Good, Dante said softly. Then we understand each other. He turned without another word and walked out. Rico didn't follow. When Dante returned to Livia's house, dawn was beginning to stretch across the sky. The air felt thinner, sharper. He moved through the hallway quietly, the floor beneath him creaking with each step. He found Amara sitting in the kitchen, a cup of untouched tea cooling in her hands. He didn't speak. She stood, walked to him, and looked at the cut on his cheek, the small tear at the collar of his shirt. Her hand reached up, brushed against his jaw, lingered. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." And this time she believed him, not because of the promise, but because of the choice behind it. He could have stayed away. He could have burned everything down. But he came back. To her, to Leo, to whatever fragile future they might still carve out from the wreckage. She leaned in slowly, her forehead resting against his, her breath soft and steady. There was no kiss, not yet. Just the weight of one heartbeat pressed against another. Two people who had been broken in different ways, finding their way back to something that might still be whole. Outside, the sun rose higher, and for the first time in years, the light didn't feel like a threat. It felt like a beginning. Chapter 8. Vows in the Dark. The night wrapped itself around the house in layers, thick and still, as if the world outside had paused to wait for something. The crickets had quieted. Even the wind had gone still. Inside, the lights had been dimmed, and Livia's snores echoed faintly from the far wing of the house, a rhythmic, oddly comforting sound that came and went like waves against the shore. Amara stood by the window of the guest room, one hand resting against the glass, her gaze fixed on the dark stretch of trees just beyond the backyard. It was late, but sleep hadn't come. It rarely did anymore. Not when she was waiting for something to shift, something to break. Behind her, the room was cast in soft amber from the bedside lamp, the bed turned down, untouched. She hadn't made up her mind to sleep, hadn't made up her mind about anything. Too much had changed in too short a time. And yet, some pieces had remained the same. Old wounds dressed in new names. But tonight, there was no war waiting, no chase. Only the ache of silence, and the man standing quietly in the doorway. Dante didn't speak when he stepped inside. He closed the door softly behind him, then leaned against the frame for a moment, his eyes never leaving her. There was something different in the way he looked at her now, less guarded, less hollow, as if something inside him had finally allowed breath again. She didn't turn. She kept her hand on the glass, tracing the invisible curve of a tree branch outside with her fingertip. "I thought you might not come back," she said, her voice calm, even though her pulse had betrayed her long before the words had left her mouth. "I almost didn't," he said quietly. "Not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't know if I deserved to." "You don't," she said, not cruelly, just truthfully. "But I don't care." He took a slow step into the room, the floor beneath him creaking in soft protest. "You've changed too," he said. "Not just the way you walk, the way you hold yourself, like you're always half prepared to run." "I am." He paused beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of him without being touched. "I want to ask you to stop," he said, and the way he said it, it wasn't a command. Not from the old Dante, not from the man who used to own rooms with silence. It was a request, a quiet, impossible one. Amara let her hand fall from the window and turned slowly to face him. His expression was unreadable, but not cold. There was something splintered beneath it, something real. His shoulders looked heavier than they had hours before, as if walking away from his brother had cost him more than he'd admitted. She studied him for a long moment, then reached up, her fingertips brushing the edge of the bruise blooming near his collarbone. "You still think you can carry everything alone," she said softly. "I'm learning." Her hand didn't fall away. It moved higher, tracing the side of his face, not with urgency, but with something slower, deeper. Her thumb brushed his jaw, then rested lightly at the curve of his neck. She felt the tension in him, the way his breath shifted under her touch. "I don't want a vow you can't keep," she said, "not tonight." "I didn't come to make promises," he said. "I came to ask if you'd let me stay." The words landed like something too delicate to hold and yet somehow too heavy to drop. She stepped closer. and when she tilted her face up to his, the distance between them narrowed until breath and thought began to blend. He didn't reach for her first. He waited. So she kissed him. Not like she had once in the reckless glow of youth and adrenaline when love had been easy and time had felt endless. This kiss was something quieter, something with gravity. Her mouth pressed to his slowly, testing, learning, forgiving. And when he kissed her back, he did it with the restraint of a man who knew how much damage he could do but chose not to. There was no rush, no firestorm. Just the slow unraveling of grief between their mouths. The unraveling of years that had sharpened them both into something bruised and unfinished. His hands found her waist, hesitant at first, then steady, anchoring her to him like he'd done once before in a different life. She stepped into the space he offered, wrapped herself in it, let herself breathe there. The kiss deepened, not with hunger but with longing. Their mouths moved like they had learned to speak each other's pain in silence. When she pulled back, it wasn't because she wanted to. It was because she needed to look at him, to see him clearly in the dim light that wrapped the room in gold. "I don't want to rebuild what we had," she whispered. He nodded, understanding something beyond the words. "I want something better," she finished. His hand slid from her waist to her back, warm and steady. His eyes held hers without hesitation now, without fear. "So do I." She took his hand and led him to the bed, slow and without ceremony. They didn't undress each other with urgency. There was no tearing, no desperation. Only quiet touches, soft exhales, fingers tracing the outlines of familiar places, learning them again with reverence. When they lay together, skin to skin beneath the heavy blanket, the night folded in around them like a second layer of warmth. Nothing was resolved. The danger hadn't passed. The past hadn't vanished. But in that room, with his breath in her hair and her body curled against his, there was something real, something earned. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the beginning of it. He didn't fall asleep right away. Neither did she. They just stayed like that, breathing together, wrapped in the soft hush of something sacred. The house didn't creak. The wind didn't return. And for the first time in a long while, Amara felt like she wasn't running. Not from danger, not from him, not even from herself. Outside, the moon passed silently behind the clouds. Inside, their hearts found rhythm again, not in the rush of escape, but in the stillness that follows when two people, battered and changed, choose to stay. Chapter 9. The dawn's return. The morning came pale and quiet. A soft veil of gray draped over the landscape as if the world itself had paused to breathe. In the silence that followed their night together, Amara lay still beneath the covers, her fingers loosely curled around the edge of the blanket, her body tucked into the lingering warmth he had left behind. She could hear him moving downstairs, light steps, careful ones, deliberate in the way only Dante could be. There was no rush in his movements, but there was a purpose in every sound. Something had shifted, not just between them, but within him, and she knew it without needing to ask. She dressed slowly, methodically, smoothing her hair back into a loose twist as her eyes flicked once more toward the spot on the bed where he had lain. The imprint of his body remained in the sheets, and for a moment she let her hand rest there, absorbing the echo of something she wasn't ready to name aloud. Not yet. But it was real, and it had taken root somewhere deep where fear and hope often fought for space. When she stepped into the hallway, she found Leo awake in Livia's sunroom, wrapped in a blanket that trailed along the floor as he shuffled barefoot across the tiles. He held his stuffed alligator like it was an extension of his own body, one sleepy eye squinting as he spotted her. "Mama," he mumbled, rubbing his face. "Is Batman still here?" She knelt down to kiss his forehead, her heart swelling with the weight of 100 unspoken things. "He is." She didn't say for how long, she didn't have to. Leo simply nodded and wandered off toward the kitchen in search of cereal and cartoons, content in the way only children could be when the world around them refused to explain itself. Amara found Dante in the parlor, standing by the fireplace with a folder in his hands and a worn jacket slung over one arm. He didn't look at her at first. He was staring into the hearth, though the ashes inside were cold, untouched since the winter before. When he finally turned, something in his expression told her he had already made the decision. He didn't need her permission, but he wanted her to know. "I have to finish it," he said quietly. "I have to look them in the eye and end it, not for revenge, but because they won't stop unless I do." She nodded once. There was no fight in her. Not this time. She had seen enough of his mind, enough of his heart, to understand what this meant. Not a retreat into violence, not a step backward into blood, but a final reckoning. "What are you going to do?" she asked. Not because she doubted him, but because she wanted to carry the weight with him, even in silence. He crossed the room slowly, stopping just close enough to reach for her hand. His fingers were warm, steady, and when he held hers, he did it as if grounding himself. Not like a man walking into war, but like a man anchoring himself to what mattered most before he let go of everything else. "I'm not going there to reclaim a throne," he said. "I'm going to burn it." She searched his face, not for fear, but for finality, and she saw it there, in the quiet steadiness of his gaze, in the tired but unshaken line of his mouth. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She had done that before once in a different lifetime when loss had looked like fire and sirens and a name carved into a gravestone. Now, she only pulled him closer, wrapped her arms around him, and held him until the moment passed. He left just after sunrise, disappearing into the morning mist with nothing but his coat, the folder, and the weight of his name. She watched the car vanish down the road, the dust rising like smoke behind it, and didn't look away until the world settled again. The city greeted him like a memory, sharp-edged and unrepentant. Buildings rose like teeth, gleaming with false promises, while the streets carried the scent of oil and rain. He didn't drive far into the heart of the empire, just enough to reach the estate where the bloodline had once meant loyalty, and now meant war. The gates opened at his arrival, not because he was welcomed, but because his presence was undeniable. The guards didn't stop him. They only watched as he passed, eyes narrowed, hands twitching near their weapons, as if unsure whether to salute or shoot. Inside, the grand hall stretched before him, the marble floor polished to a shine, the chandeliers above still glittering with the excess of a family that believed appearances were power. At the end of the room sat the old council, gray-haired, cold-eyed, faces marked with the weight of decades, and beside them stood Rico, dressed in a tailored suit and a smile that barely concealed the tension beneath it. Dante didn't speak first. He walked to the center of the room, unflinching, steady, his presence filling the space like a storm, waiting for a break in the sky. "You were supposed to stay dead," Rico said finally, the words smooth but forced. "I was supposed to trust you," Dante replied, his voice calm. "But here we are." There were no raised voices, no drawn guns, just the hum of unspoken threats hanging in the air like smoke. Dante laid the folder on the table in front of them. Papers, documents, files collected in the shadows. Names, numbers. Deals made in blood and betrayal. Proof of Rico's hand in every deception, every lie that had unraveled the family from within. The council didn't speak for a long time. They only looked at the pages and then at Rico, who was already backing away, the smile gone, his eyes flicking toward the door, as if escape might still be an option. But Dante didn't follow. He didn't have to. By the time he walked out of the estate, Rico had been stripped of everything but his name, and even that no longer held power. He returned to Livia's house as the sun dipped low again, a slow descent of gold through the trees. The gravel crunched beneath the tires just as it had before, but this time, Amara was already standing on the porch. She didn't run to him, she didn't wait inside. She just stood there, arms folded, eyes fixed on him with something steadier than hope. He stepped out of the car and walked toward her. His shoulders no longer bore the same weight. Something had lifted. Something had broken and mended in the same breath. "It's done," he said. She didn't ask how, she didn't need to. She reached for his hand, and this time, it wasn't to steady him, it was to welcome him back. Not as a ghost, not as a fugitive, but as a man who had walked through the fire and returned not to reclaim what was lost, but to build something new. Behind them, the house hummed with the sound of Leo laughing somewhere inside. And above them, the evening settled with the soft rustle of leaves, as if even the wind had finally found its way home. Chapter 10. Not a ghost anymore. Weeks passed like the slow drift of autumn leaves, steady and deliberate, peeling the world back to something quiet and bare. The chaos, the chase, the long nights marked by fear and loaded silences, all of it faded into something distant, like a fever dream that only returned in moments of stillness. The kind where breath slowed and memory had time to creep in through the cracks. The house they now called home sat at the edge of a nameless town, tucked between rolling hills and crooked fences, where no one asked questions and strangers didn't linger. It wasn't grand, not like the marble palaces of Dante's youth, or the shadowed sanctuaries where Amara had once hidden herself away. But it was enough. 2 bedrooms, a wide porch, windows that caught the sun just right in the early morning, and a kitchen with a leaky faucet that Dante still hadn't managed to fix. She teased him about it sometimes, especially when the dripping grew louder after midnight. He pretended not to hear, but she'd catch him studying the sink like it had challenged his authority. There was no army of men watching the house, no whispers in alleyways, no messages scribbled in code or threats folded into family dinners. The world had gone still around them, or maybe they had simply stepped out of its reach. Amara had taken a job at the small bakery in town, the kind of place that smelled like warm sugar and cinnamon the moment you opened the door. Leo, always restless, spent his afternoons drawing dragons on the floor of the back room, offering commentary on frosting consistency and demanding more sprinkles than strictly necessary. The other women there doted on him endlessly, and though she pretended to protest the attention, Amara knew it brought her a strange kind of peace to see him adored by people who didn't carry guns beneath their coats. Dante stayed close, always within reach, though never idle. He'd begun to repair the old barn behind the house, rebuilding the collapsed roof by hand, board by board. At night, his hands were rough and blistered, but she saw something in him she hadn't seen in years. Purpose that wasn't tied to blood or vengeance. Work that asked nothing of him except time and gave him something back in return. Sometimes he'd let Leo sit beside him while he hammered or measured, nodding patiently as the boy explained how they were really building a secret fortress for the superfamily. Amara watched them once from the upstairs window, father and son crouched in the dust, one explaining blueprints drawn in crayon, the other listening as if the fate of the world depended on it. They didn't speak much about the past, not because they feared it, but because it had already taken enough from them. What mattered now was that it no longer followed them, that it no longer had teeth. It was a warm Sunday afternoon when Amara found herself alone in the garden, kneeling between rows of struggling tomato plants. The soil was stubborn, full of clay and rock, but she kept trying. There was something soothing about the fight. Behind her, wind chimes knocked gently against the siding. Somewhere inside, Leo was likely plotting the next chapter of his imaginary superhero saga. And somewhere behind her, she could feel Dante before he even spoke. He stepped onto the grass with the soundless confidence that still caught her off guard sometimes. She didn't look up right away, just kept digging her fingers into the dirt, feeling it press beneath her nails. "He asked if we could have another baby," Dante said finally, his tone low and careful. She paused. A half-laugh escaped before she could stop it. "Did he now?" "He wants a sister. He said if she has laser eyes, that would be preferable." Amara turned her head, giving him a look that mixed amusement and disbelief. "He's impossible." "He's persuasive," Dante said, crouching beside her. They stayed there for a moment, knees in the dirt, shoulders brushing. The sun caught in his hair, softening the lines of his face, the hard-won calm behind his eyes. He reached out, fingers brushing a smudge of soil from her cheek. "I meant to wait longer to say this," he murmured. "To let more time pass. To be sure." "You don't have to." "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Sirius," he said. "Not anymore. I'm asking if you'll keep choosing me. Not because you feel you should, but because you want to." Her breath caught not from surprise but from the weight of what that meant. He wasn't offering some grand vow laced in shadows. He wasn't giving her a future wrapped in danger. He was offering a life. Just this. These quiet moments, the rebuilding. The love not carved in fire but planted like seeds in soil that might one day bloom. She didn't answer with words. She leaned in and kissed him, slow and deep, her hands cupping his face as if to say, yes, again, and again, and again. And he kissed her back with the same reverence he had shown that night, weeks ago, when the world had been darker and the future more uncertain. Later that evening, after Leo had been bathed and bribed into bed with a promise of pancakes and extra syrup, they sat on the porch with glasses of wine and bare feet propped on the railing. The stars stretched above them, countless and still. Dante reached for her hand, laced his fingers through hers, and let his head rest back against the wooden post. "I used to think I died in that fire," he said softly, "that the man who loved you didn't survive." She turned to look at him, her eyes catching the glint of starlight on his skin. "He didn't." He nodded once, as if he'd expected it. "But the man who came back," she added, her voice steady, "is the one I want to keep." He looked at her then, truly looked, and for once there was no tension behind his smile, no edge of grief, just a quiet joy that came not from having everything, but from finally wanting nothing more than what he had. In the quiet that followed, the night wrapped around them like a promise, not of perfection, but of presence. And though the world beyond their borders still carried its noise, its scars, its weight, none of it touched them here, and not tonight and not anymore. The end.